So today, I'm very happy to introduce this panel titled "Hindu Belonging and Minority Recognition in Pakistan." This has really been the brainchild and the effort of Professor Natasha Raheja, who's my colleague in the Department of Anthropology at Cornell, and she's put together this panel. Natasha Raheja is an anthropologist working actually on a number of important topics, including the question of the Sindh and the and Sindhi minorities in both in Pakistan and India, it's being originally from Pakistan myself, I cannot stress the importance of this topic, both for its scholarly dimensions as well as for its kind of public, dimensions. So I'm very happy to welcome the panelists. So the panelists will be introduced by Natasha, and just in terms of the mechanics of today, if you have questions for the panel, please type them in the Q&A box, which is below on the screen. And at the end, we will have, I hope we will have a chance to address some of your questions. And so today's panel will be moderated by Natasha Raheja, whom I now hand over the microphone.
Thank you, Iftikhar, and thank you so much to the Cornell South Asia program, especially Daniel and Gloria for helping organize this roundtable, and the speakers for joining us, and welcome to those of you in attendance. So as Iftikhar mentioned, I'm an assistant professor of anthropology here at Cornell, where I myself research questions of Pakistani Hindu religious minority citizenship in Western India. And in thinking about religious minorities in Islamic societies and Muslim majority states in the US Academy, as we are located here at Cornell, however virtual our reach is, we have to confront the way academic knowledge is weaponized in the global war on terror. This is a consistent pressure on an examination of minority recognition in Pakistan, the burden of which we all carry differently. But in having these conversations about how the identities of the majority, the minority, or the other shift across time and space, we can make connections that help us understand how majoritarianism works outside of any fixed essentialized identity. So while academic fora on South Asia engage with questions of religious majoritarianism and minority recognition, typically in relation to Hindutva and India, thinking alongside about minority recognition in Pakistan can, among other insights, move forward frameworks to think about Hindu and Muslim majoritarianism as an interconnected colonial legacy of what historian Manan Ahmed has recently called the loss of Hindustan across the South Asia region more broadly. So moving to today's Sindh, Pakistan-centered conversation, each speaker will talk for 7 minutes, and then I will pose a few questions for discussion with the speakers for about 20 minutes before opening up to audience questions that come in through the Q&A window. You can post questions before, and if related, I can integrate them into the discussion. I'm pleased that we have with us today, in speaking order, Kapil Dev, Dr. Juergen Schaflechner. Kapil Dev's joining us from Karachi. Dr. Juergen Schaflechner is joining us from Berlin. Chander Kolhi joining us from Mitti, Sindh. Ghazal Asif in Singapore. And I wish we were all together, but happy to be here together with you on this screen. And in lieu of verbal introductions, I will be posting each speaker's more detailed bio in the chat when they speak. We'll begin with Kapil, who will be speaking on the term non-Muslim and the negation of Hindu identity.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm really grateful to South Asia Program Cornell, in particular Natasha Raheja, for inviting me as a panelist on this important subject. This is indeed a huge honor for me speaking at such an international forum. Today I will be talking about negation of Hindu identity in post-colonial Pakistan. And I will be sharing how negation of identity leads to otherization, marginalization, and discrimination in socio-political, economic, and public space life of a Pakistani Hindu. Though I am not an ethnographer who has spent some time in the field and who has come up with certain say, data research. Rather, on a lighter note, I myself an ethnography of this subject. In fact, I am an activist, and I will talk about lived experiences of someone who has grown up with a negative identity. Yes, it's a negative identity. Well, elsewhere in the world, or let's say in the US, no one would ask you whether you are a Christian or whether you are a non-Christian, whether you are a non-Jew. But here in our parts of Pakistan, okay, our identity is clothed as non-Muslim. Pakistan is a Muslim majority country with 96% of its population are Muslim, and rest of 4% population, they are identified as non-Muslims, including Hindus, Christians, Sikhs, and others. Or you can say sometime I'm labeled as non-Muslim, and sometime in Urdu we are called as a Ghair Muslim. A Ghair Muslim is a word which is used for Hindu identity in Pakistan. So what I see that, and I would like to narrate my personal story as to how it made me realize that why my identity is different from being a Hindu to a non-Muslim. How this identity has been shaped up, because what I feel when you are using prefix non, so prefix non actually negates my identity. So non means the non is just like none, or somebody who's having, who's not having something. So it's just like on a lighter note, I can again say that it's just like a sense, and one nobody is who's saying a nonsense like this. So this is a question which has been, perplexing my mind for many years. So narrating my personal story, what I can say that I was born and brought up in a Hindu majority town. It's called named Mithi, so which is in the south of Pakistan, Sindh province. That also borders with Indian Rajasthan. So that thought never came to mind that I am a minority in Pakistan, or I am a non-Muslim or a Ghair Muslim. The Ghair Muslim, the word Ghair in Urdu means a stranger, because Mithi is predominantly a Hindu majority town with 90% of the business being controlled by Hindu traders. Schools I studied in was headed by a Hindu principal. Teachers who taught me were Hindus. My peers, my colleagues, my peers, they were also Hindu. So it's predominantly a Hindu majority town, and we celebrate our festivals, be it a Diwali, be it a Holi, Janmashtami, and Dasera. Every festival we celebrate it. Okay, so and one can see that on the eve of Holi, all the streets are poured with these colors. On the eve of Diwali, one can see the lights. Okay, the whole town is lit with the lights. So it's a completely Hindu atmosphere all around me, and I can only think myself of a Hindu. The surprise came for me when I completed my matriculation and when I moved to Hyderabad. So when I was in Hyderabad, what I found that in Hyderabad, so when we were searching for an apartment, one of the tenants of an apartment refused to rent out his apartment to us on the pretext that we were non-Muslim. So that was a bit shock for me. That what is non-Muslim to me? Because I never thought that I'm a non-Muslim in the country. I was always told, and I always read word non-Muslim in my curriculum books. I never read elsewhere. So that actually led me to think over something. Then the surprise came to me because by the time I was also raising my political consciousness as well, and I was also part of student politics as well. So then I moved to Islamabad for my master's degree in English literature. So there I got admission in National University of Modern Languages. So when in my orientation session, one of my teacher asked me for my introduction, and when I introduced myself, and she asked me when I told my name, Kapil Dev, and she was, oh, you are a non-Muslim. I said, no, ma'am, I'm a Hindu. She said, these both are same thing. No, I said, these both are not same thing, because Hindu is my religious identity. Non-Muslim is not my religious identity. So that was a thing that actually raised eyebrows of so many students who were sitting. In fact, of my teacher, says, and she said, you are actually making a fuss out of nothing. So I said, no, ma'am, this is a question of my identity. That really, because non-Muslim is not my identity. My identity is being a Hindu. And that's the question. I think these two things were really bit shocker to me. That was cultural shocks to me, because the books were telling something else, and I was brought up in something else, in some other atmosphere. So these two things coming to Karachi, coming to Hyderabad, and coming to Islamabad, that really changed my life. And by the time I had also raised my political consciousness. So what happens next? That really impacts my life. So I try to dig out deep in this question, that why this whole concept of negation of my identity. What I felt that I read a book, and I think it was a Mahmood Mamdani's book, The Define and Rule. So what I learned from that book, So that in 1857, so when there was, you can say, Hindus and Muslims, they were jointly fighting against the British imperialist British rulers. So then they thought that they should come up with an idea of indirect rule. So that how the indirect rule came, because they actually decided to conduct census. The first census of subcontinent were conducted in 1861. That's how they tried to define us. Okay, that's how it formed governmentality, that who will be doing what. So this is what that things happened. So in 1857 we were defined as Hindu. In 1947 we were defined as non-Muslim by the Pakistani state. So how this identity actually affected this whole in Pakistan, what we see in daily life, we say we face so many discrimination. Our books, which has stereotyped us as non-Muslims. And what else? What we see in Pakistan, that certain jobs are not allowed for Hindus. A Pakistan Hindu cannot become prime minister, cannot become president, cannot go in the armed forces in artillery services, cannot go into the secret services. Okay, so that's how we are excluded. So our nationalism is our whole nationalism is based on our identity, which is binary. So our nationalism based on Pakistan is for Muslims. So that is exclusive. That's exclusive, not inclusive. So I think my time is up. So I can take rest of the questions during my question answer session. Thank you, Natasha.
We'll move now to Dr. Schaflechner speaking about wary and aware Hindu performances in the public sphere.
Right. So I was experiencing some problems with the microphone before. So can you hear me? Can you just give me everything good? Okay. Right. So thank you for organizing this. That's a really important workshop. So what my work, or what I'm interested in, are particularly these representations that Kapil talked about, right? So representations of so-called non-Muslim communities in Pakistan. And then in the second step, the subjectivities that such interpellations allow. So I'm not only looking at legislations and repressive state measures, so to say, but also at other outputs where we find nation state ideology. And then the question, of course, is what do they reveal, or what images do they reveal of non-Muslim belonging in the Islamic Republic? Now, for a very long time, people have been talking about school books. They have been pointed at as one of the main sources for so-called nafrat angeez mawat, or hate speech. And I think for a very good reason so, because still now you can find sentences such as, and I'm quoting here directly, the Hindu has always been an enemy of Islam, or another quote, the Bharat is the country of non-Muslims. So these sentences are frequently found. Now, what I think is important in this regard is that we need to extend this investigation to popular culture. This means we need to look at TV series, Urdu Pulp Fiction, where I'm going to give you an example in a second, but also widely shared memes, or GIFs that come through WhatsApp, and to see how they perpetuate stereotypes of this kind of non-Muslim belonging. Maybe we can reformulate this a little bit into a question to make this less abstract. This could be simply, so which forms of non-Muslim Pakistani belonging are possible, and in which of Pakistan's many public spheres? And how do then, in such an environment, actors negotiate their political demands, their stereotype threats, but also discourses of victimhood? And I think the last question is something that we also as academics need to be very cautious of, and ask ourselves in which way we ourselves are only allowing Pakistani Hindu identity through the lens of victimhood, right? So time is short. Let me just give you an example of the representations that I'm talking about. So as I said, I'm looking at Pulp Fiction these days. Different genres, and interestingly, different genres are very conducive to different forms of stereotypes. So Jasusi Digest, for example, I digest for detective, spy novels, would feature more stories and thus also stereotypes about Israel and Jews, while the horror genre seems, thus far, I'm not 100% sure, but it seems like for what I've seen now, is completely favoring Hindus. So we can go down the rabbit hole of interpretation in this moment, but I don't think there's really time for that. I'm happy to talk about this in the Q&A later. But also in kind of blatant self-advertisement, I wrote an article about this very particular relationship, I think, between, you know, the Hindu as the objective other of the Dogma Nazaria of the two-nation theory. So I think that there is a reason why the horror genre is very particular and picks up Hindus very often. So I looked at one magazine in particular called Dar Digest, which is a monthly, which was very fruitful in this regard. So Dar Digest has a wide dissemination, so to say, around 10 to 11,000 copies sold per month. So the content is not completely marginal, especially when we consider that the largest newspaper in Pakistan, the news has around 120,000 copies as a circulation. So this Dar Digest has been published for 18 consecutive years. So I looked at half of those. And what I found is, and the sample is 26 stories that featured Hindu protagonists, where you had a very, very straightforward kind of bifurcation of good and evil there. And you very often had the same kind of stereotype. So the question then that comes up is, how often do these stories then pop up? And so for 2015, for example, I counted 11 stories that featured Hindu protagonists, always in the same kind of way. This means almost every issue one story. So how do these stories look like? Maut ke Ghat, the gates of death, is one of the stories I want to talk about briefly. So I would like to read you out this little part, which is a paraphrase of my translation. So it goes like this. The netherworld, much like the real world, is full of Muslims, Hindu, and Christian tribes. The Muslim ghost tribe, or as it's in the Urdu, the Musalman Kabile ke Jinn, has the power of God's light, the Nur, while the Hindus are demonic and atheistic idol worshippers, or as the Urdu reads, Bedin or Shaitani Mazhab Rakhne Wale Jinn. And they all want to convert everyone to Hinduism. The only way for the Muslim jinns to survive is a pious Muslim human who can kill the leader of the Hindus, who is called the general, and has the same characteristics as are in the iconography of Shiva, by the way. The Muslim jinns pick this Dilshad Umar, a young man who is known for his compassion and his willingness to help others. Long story short, Dilshad agrees to help, disguised as one of the close allies of the evil general. Then Dilshad kills the evil demon and sets the Muslim spirits free from the tyranny of the Hindu spirits. Now, like many other stories, Maut ke Ghat portrays Hindu and Muslim relations in a clear-cut language of good versus evil. The evil Hindus are the main obstacles to a prospering Muslim community, here in the form of the Muslim jinns. The story's foundation therefore reiterates the two-nation theory as an unbridgeable Hindu-Muslim conflict in the spirit world, making the dispute even into an ontological kind of chasm. And this is only one example, and I could give you many more, but unfortunately, there's not the time for that. So let me conclude. Stereotypes are extremely ambivalent. So on the one hand, they claim to stand in for timeless truths, and they are unsurprising and predictable. Well, on the other hand, they constantly evolve in the response to the passing of time and the changes in space. So for stereotypes to keep constant, to keep universal, they need a solidification that is constant over time, so that they appear to be universal and unchanging. I think that popular culture is one of the places where we need to look a little bit deeper to analyze these forms of stereotypes. Because when we understand these stereotypes and we understand the atmosphere from where actors are coming, then I think it's also easier for us to understand non-Muslim social movements and the pushes towards emancipation and equality. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll now move to Chander Kolhi, speaking on scheduled caste inequity and justice in Sindh, Pakistan.
Thank you so much, Natasha, for giving me a chance to speak on this wonderful topic. And I think that there's a need to discuss this topic in a broader way, and we need several sessions to discuss the importance of the inequality and injustice to scheduled caste communities in Pakistan. I remember in 2015, a movement restarted about scheduled caste equality and justice for them. I used to live there. I used to live at the time in Dubai, and from there I started beginning tweets, and I started beginning posts on Facebook about the equality and justice within Hindu communities in Pakistan. But I was very much criticized by my Hindu friends who used to say me that the caste-based discrimination, by supporting caste-based discrimination or working on that issue, I am actually working on anti-Hinduism. But my motive was not working on on anti-Hinduism, but the topic was only for bringing and giving the equality to scheduled caste communities who are living in Pakistan. It has been more than 7 decades since they are suffering from different kind of issues. They are not giving political representation. Their education is too low. Majority of them is literate. They are working as laborers. Their lands are grabbed. Their people are murdered. Their girls are abducted, and nothing happens. So the fight was for the equality and justice to the scheduled caste community. But people used to understand that this caste-based discrimination is actually against Hindu religion, but it was not like that. On the other hand, caste-based discrimination in Pakistan is often found in rural communities, like in cities. All the Hindu boys and families are living together. Like the people who are from Brahmin community, the people who are from scheduled caste community are living together. In cities, the issues of discrimination is not too much, but it's to a little extent. But in rural society, the issue is too much. They have separate pots. They are getting separate glasses. They are not given permission to sit on the bed in the houses of the landlords, and they are very much mistreated by these community persons. Additionally, the caste-based discrimination is not only from the upper caste, but within caste, and then there are subcastes. Like if there is a person who is from Kolhi or Megwar community, then there are subcastes. These subcastes also discriminate each other. Then the castes like Megwar and Kolhis also discriminate each other. Just a few days ago, I just saw a few children who were drinking water from a water tank outside my house in Michi, and I used to say them that the glass is on the top. Why don't you take that glass? So he just said to me that the glass is of Kolhis and we are wheels, so we will not use this glass because we are superior than Kolhis and things like that. So this mentality is only because the parents might have taught them that you have to keep a distance from Kolhis, wheels or Megwars. This thing happens. Additionally, the literacy ratio of scheduled caste community is very low. Out of the total 100% population, I think the community chiefs, as per the estimations by the community chiefs, less than 10% are educated, and majority of the children, majority of the population is very illiterate, and they have no idea of what is for the betterment, what is for the empowerment, and what they should do. On the other side, there is the issue of conversion as well, and the conversion is in Pakistan is of two types. The one is willful, and the other one is forceful. Unfortunately, in Pakistan, human rights activists often what they do is often they show that the willful conversion is also a forceful conversion. I have seen in many villages. I have conducted some case studies as well, where I spoke to the girls, where I spoke to the families, and found that there was the person who has abducted the girl who is called to be the forceful conversion, has eloped at her own will, and she has chose by her own opinion that she wanted to marry with a boy. And often in Pakistani society, if you see, then there are very less religious institutes, or it's equivalent to less than 1 or 2% of the overall population. Like religious institutes are not there for Hindus. They have no proper knowledge of what is for the betterment. They have no religious information of their religious stories. They have no knowledge of what they should do for the betterment. And our girls are also very are often kept illiterate, and they are not given permission to get education from the schools. Hardly less than 1% of the girls reaches to the universities, and often they are married at a very child age. So this is a drawback from the society. This is a drawback of our own people, and there is a need to highly discuss these things in the society, to conduct some seminars and to discuss things like this. Additionally, in the recent times, due to COVID-19 and flood especially in Sindh, the government had no proper mechanism to support the people, and their lives are totally disturbed. They are facing a lot of issues for which their solution is needed. The economic conditions are also so weak, and often they commit suicide. The girls who are married at a very young age, they have no proper understanding of what they should do for their children, what they should do for the betterment, and they commit suicide. So I think that there's a dire need for the NGOs, for the international NGOs working in Pakistan and the government of Pakistan to focus on these issues, which are faced by the scheduled caste communities, and they should organize some kind of seminar. They should build some institutes where the empowerment is possible. Rest of the questions will be responded in the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll move to Ghazal Asif, speaking about the Hindu Marriage Act in 2017.
Thank you, Natasha, and thank you for hosting this really great conversation. So just building off some issues that Chander laid out very nicely, I'm just going to talk today very briefly about some issues that have been raised in recent discourse about Hindu marriages and the Hindu family in Pakistan. And specifically, I will talk about this recent law passed in 2017 that's aimed at the Hindu community, the 2017 Hindu Marriage and Family Act. So just to provide a little bit of context, I will just say that under British rule in post-colonial states such as Pakistan, a universal criminal code of law was accompanied by personal status laws with regulations on marriage, divorce, inheritance, adoptions, etc., which were considered to be part of the family realm. And these personal status laws were differentiated according to religion, so Muslim personal laws, Hindu personal laws, Christian personal laws, and so on. And this difference in personal and criminal law has carried over into Pakistan, although there are some important post-colonial differences. So in Pakistan, most of the conversation on family law has traditionally been on Muslim family law in the, in a heavily Muslim-dominated state. And this law set up bureaucratic procedures in the 60s about the conduct, registration, mediation, and dissolution of marriages, and set up standardized procedures for inheritance, and clarified women's rights within the Muslim family. The Hindu Marriage and Family Act, which was passed in 2017, performs similar actions. But because of the very different ways in which the Hindu and the Muslim family and the Hindu minority and the Muslim majority are treated in Pakistan, these laws have acquired very different valences, and the conversation around the Hindu Marriage and Family Act is very different. So I'll just sketch a few points about that right now. So the preamble to this 2017 Act states that it is a constitutional obligation of the state to protect the marriage, the family, the mother, and the child, and to safeguard the legitimate rights and interests of minorities. And it is expedient to have a consolidated law providing for the solemnization of marriages by Hindu families. So what's interesting about this setup of this law and how it's being framed is that it is imagined as a way of creating a new relationship between the Pakistani state and Hindu religious minorities now in 2017 that is mediated by Hindu women and the Hindu family. So this is the reason that the language of the law, which I don't have space to get into here, but throughout this act, it focuses on regularization processes such as marriage registration, formal procedures of annulment and divorce, etc. And what the law was intended to do was create space within the family courts and the municipal bureaucracies to accommodate the Hindu family within an overwhelmingly Muslim legal system in which often denial of bureaucratic procedures can equal denial of citizenship for Hindus. It called for enabling the formal registration of Hindu marriages, the appointment of marriage registrars for Hindus across the country, and procedures for divorce and separation. One of the main impetuses for the law came about in 2011 when the Supreme Court noted that the absence of formal mechanisms for registering Hindu marriages hampered Hindu women's access to the state, particularly in terms of an inability to secure national identity cards. I should mention that many Hindu activists and Hindu rights groups had been campaigning for a long time before this for the passage of such a law, but it was the Supreme Court's actions that sort of spurred the gears of the state into action. Now, without registration of women's kinship through marriage, the Supreme Court noted, documents such as national identity cards are difficult to access for Hindu women. So the 2017 Act, this is where the 2017 Act took its cue in emphasizing the registration of marriages. And from a legal standpoint, therefore, the formal registration of Pakistani Hindu marriages is important to enable the married Hindu woman to seek protection from the Pakistani state as a full-fledged citizen. So this act, as I stated earlier, positions itself as a matter of women's rights and empowerments, and it also works to standardize Hindu kinship by a Muslim-dominated state. Although this encountered some resistance, and if you look at the various drafts of the law that were presented in the parliament over several years, you can see this in back and forths about standards of consanguineous relationships for marriage and in the standardization of divorce procedures. Since these are aspects of marriage and kinship that normally vary between different regions, different castes, different biradris, and among Pakistani Hindus. So their standardization proved quite controversial. Especially with regards to divorce. I have interviewed several senior, mostly upper caste Hindu lawyers involved in the making of the final draft, who said that there was a great deal of objection over the inclusion of divorce procedures because according to them, there is no sanctioning of divorce in Hindu marriage customs. This was resisted, this has counterfactuals, it doesn't speak to all Hindu communities in Pakistan, and therefore proved to be a major sticking point. In the end, though, there were standardized divorce procedures included in the law. And this is one of the reasons that it was stuck for so long. There was no consensus on its passing, although all stakeholders did agree on the need to formalize marriage registration in particular through the law. Now, since its passage, this 2017 Act has become taken up in broader conversations about Hindu women's rights, issues relating to a phenomenon that my colleague Chander also mentioned, known as the forced conversion and marriage of Hindu women, which has been documented as being on the rise in the past couple of decades. This, just to describe it very, very crudely and briefly, involves young Hindu women disappearing from their natal homes, resurfacing as converted Muslims, married to Muslim men. And I do want to emphasize that these are complex, multi-layered events, and they raise very difficult questions about agency, kinship, and forms of desire under conditions of very serious generational inequality and oppression. But I will say that there is consensus that these acts of conversion cut off women from their natal homes. And the debate is structurally on whether this should or should not be considered a punitive act of oppression by majority Muslim men over a vulnerable minority community. And this is where a lot of the emphasis is on whether something was forced or willful, as Chander pointed out. And the other significant thing about this is that it also evokes a very long history of intercommunal violence in South Asia being mapped onto the bodies of women. So as I said earlier, this act was framed as creating a new relationship between the state and Hindu religious minorities mediated by Hindu women. And this is increasingly it's a relationship that is discussed through the incidence of forced conversion, which in turn changes the modality of this law's governance of the Hindu family. And one of the things that I show in my ongoing research is how tying the new law's regulations to the phenomenon of forced conversions, which are, as I said, seen as an act of dominance, can reveal the contours of a landscape of gendered violence for Hindu women. Just to quickly wrap up, so what I've trying to think about is how questions of minority rights, human rights, and women's agency become wrapped up in debates about the state's demands for standardizing existing relationships, existing family practices through the law. And looking at the 2017 Hindu Marriage and Family Act, I'm trying to think about how these in turn drive debates about control over women's bodies and questions of violence against minority women in a majoritarian context. And I'm happy to answer more questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you to each of you for your very rich opening and illuminating comments, leaving us eager to engage with you more now. So one of the things that each of your remarks touched on was, despite the exclusion that Hindus, both caste Hindus and scheduled caste Hindus in Pakistan experience, they still hold intimate attachments to recognition and national belonging as Pakistanis. So the first question I'd like to pose is to Kapil and Chander about the language of minority or aqliyat, its affective charge and its rejection. So in thinking about how in the debates about Hindus in Pakistan, the language of minority assumes that there's a national community which stands apart and outside of the inclusion and recognition of non-Muslim, in this case, Hindu minorities. Some Hindu activists, including Kapil and others, have refused the term minority, calling for equal citizenship as something separate. And we've also seen how Pakistani state actors have this ambivalent relationship to the word minority. For example, in February 2020, Imran Khan used the anti-Muslim pogrom in Delhi as a moment to tweet that Pakistan welcomes its minorities as equal citizens. How Kapil has challenged this term non-Muslim as a negation of Hindu identity, but I wanted to ask you and Chander to elaborate on Pakistani Hindus' ambivalent relationship to this word minority and how you as activists reject and engage with this term, minority or aqliyat. So Chander or Kapil.
So okay, I think let me go first. So I think the word, actually the identity when it comes, so we have to look into the Pakistan's, you know, say, state narrative as well. The way it is shaped, the way how it is shaped, that's quite important. Because in Pakistan's nationalism narrative, that is directly connected with Pakistan is for Muslims. Okay, so that narrative, that whole narrative excludes us. So that actually when we are excluded from this whole narrative, so then when we are confined to this minority word or the non-Muslim or the ghair Muslim or the aqliyat, so that actually affects when you are in terms of, you know, say numerical figure, we are minority, that's okay, but you cannot minoritize them, you cannot marginalize them, you cannot otherize them, because that's how, because language actually shapes your ideas. We only think into the language, we do not think without, we cannot think about any idea without language. So how this linguistics impact, okay, how this language impacts on the minds of the people, that's how it reinforces the idea that minorities, they are not from us. Because in Urdu, what we say in ghair word, ghair means jo apna nahi hota hai, the one who is not ours, the one who is a stranger. So that actually leaves a huge impact. So we don't buy this word, because we should be treated as a equal citizen. We should be treated as equal citizens in Pakistan. This is how I see it. And over to you, Chander.
Thank you so much, Kapil. I would just like to say that I think as we have learned from our schools and from our colleges, from the curriculum which is taught to us, I have learned that this country was not built for Hindus. It was built for Muslims. And the minorities are something that's very common in every country. In every country, there are majority and there is minority. So what we are called minority, I believe that this word we should not be called by this word, but we should be called as Hindus. We should give it a separate identity of being Hindus. On the other hand, if we connect this thing with the scheduled caste in Pakistan or scheduled caste in any country, the thing is, our own Hindus feel themselves to be the superiors. So the thing is, why don't they call scheduled caste as superiors, or why don't they count them as well in their population? So the thing is, like, we should be given the identity of being Hindu instead of giving the identity of being minority. And additionally, I think instead of criticizing the word as Muslim, we should start debating on this word, and we should teach it, or we should discuss it with the youth of Pakistan, because the generation is yet to go, and they will decide the future of Pakistan. And there is a need to discuss the issue of either we should be called as a non-Muslim, or we should be called as Hindu, or we should be called as minority. Should be discussed with the youth of Pakistan. And this is my opinion over this.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I know you've written a little bit about the category of minority and the rejection and refusal of this term, if you'd like to add to the conversation.
Yeah, I think Kapil and Chander, expressed it very eloquently. I will just add that often one of the, and I think Natasha, your work also speaks to this, is that this is something that is very exclusive to the English word minority, and it does not come across in the Urdu term aqliyat. And maybe Kapil, this is an interesting part of the tension, is that minority also speaks to a patronizing tone. A minority is it's not it cannot be a relationship of equality, even moving beyond numbers, and that may be part of this tension as well, and maybe sort of feeding into this, because in Pakistan the discourse is very heavily minority majority.
Thank you. Yeah, so in thinking about how we're organized here today, all of us have worked in Sindh and in the province of Sindh in Pakistan. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to flesh out the kind of Sindh dimensions of this work and thinking about Hindus in Pakistan, for example. And I'm directing this to Ghazal and Juergen, but Kapil and Chander, feel free to chime in if you have something to add. So in terms of thinking about Hindus comprise, the largest population of Hindus are in Sindh. Sindh Assembly has had some of the most progressive legislation around Hindu issues as compared to other provinces and to the National Assembly. I'm also thinking of Sindh-specific discourses that we learn about in the academic work of Julian Leveska or Michel Boivin, who have talked about histories of Sindhi Sufi syncretism and how that shapes these Hindu claims to recognition within Sindh and how Sindh is positioned in the larger national landscape of Pakistan. I am curious too to hear more about Kapil. I know on Twitter your tagline is that you are a Sindhi, a Hindu, and a communist, and this makes you a three-headed monster for the Pakistani state. And I know that that reminds me of the language that Comrade Sobo Gyanchandani used to use to describe himself. So how can we think about the constellation of the relationship between even questions of Sindhi nationalism and how they shape Hindu determination within the larger Pakistani conversation? And of course, there are longer histories too that historians have talked about in terms of the cosmopolitan and pluralistic connections in the region. So I'll start with Juergen and then Ghazal, and if anyone else would like to add.
I mean, the dimension of Sindh is crucial in this regard, not because parts of what we look at, particularly in terms of the representation of Hindus or Christians, are things that basically pertain to the urban Pakistani sphere, right? So Sindh, and what we need to understand with the Sindh is that there are parts within Sindh where the nation state doesn't really touch. So the land, the feudal elite is in certain areas in a position where the categories that we have been thinking of in terms of nation state identity do not 100% work, right? So we have a completely different form of taxonomy with its own kinds of problems. So rural Sindh might be famous for the idea that a Sindhi identity kind of surpasses the distinction between Hinduism and Islam. However, the distinction between the poor people and the elite, so to say, might then be another form of discrimination that we need to think of. So Sindh in particular, I think is interesting because we also need to turn the narrative a little bit. We also need to understand that there are certain parts, and Kapil has talked about this brilliantly, where Hindus are in the majority, where parts of Pakistan would not look different to any villages in India as well. And so there you have a completely different form of, and this is why I love the story that Kapil told us before, that there's a completely different kind of environment which does not necessarily relate to the same forms of discrimination that we talked about.
Ghazal?
Yeah, thank you. This is a very, I agree that this is, I think, a very crucial question, the question of Sindhi identity. And I mean, one of the things that I would like to flag is that the forms of both Sindhi Islam and Sindhi Hinduism are also quite unique. So when we talk, as you mentioned, it's not just a question of, yes, Sindh has a syncretic culture, or, you know, the relationship of Sufism to Sindh, but also the forms of religion that in Sindh are, you know, there are very specific cultural forms that have been shaped in relationship to one another. And here I would also like to flag not just, I mean, you know, one of the things, sometimes this becomes a kind of an ahistorical argument, but these are constantly evolving relationships. So major historical events have continued to shape these relationships. But I think the relationship, as Juergen pointed out, the relationship of Sindh to the Pakistani nation state, as well as the relationship of Sindhi forms of religion to the kinds of religious majoritarianism that is imposed by the Pakistani nation state. Those clashes are, or they're not always clashes, but those differences are worth investigating to see what they reveal about the kinds of lives that are imaginable for minorities in Sindh, and what kinds of human flourishing or what kind of social flourishing can take place. So I think in terms of imagining a future, I think they're very useful.
And Ghazal, your work has also pointed to the specificity of intercaste relations in Sindh and thinking about how caste politics works outside of a large presence of Brahminical dominance and Brahmin caste. So if you want to add.
Yeah, here, so one of the things that in the historical sort of investigation in my work, I've looked at how it is that the relationship of Hindus to the Pakistani nation state started out not in Sindh in 1947, but in East Bengal, what was formerly known as East Bengal. And those categories where, you know, before 1971, there was a very deep-seated hermeneutics of suspicion around peasant movements, around Bengali ethnic assertion and Bengali language, and the fact that Bengal was the place that had the most non-Muslim or Hindu populations in Pakistan. These had become, you know, sort of wrapped up in one another in very complicated ways by 1971. And with the liberation of Bangladesh in 1971, what's interesting is that things turned towards Sindh, which was now the place that had the largest Hindu population in Pakistan. And this is why understanding regional formulations is so important, because Sindhi, the Sindhi caste system, Sindhi forms of religion, etc., everything is very different from what was going on in Bengal and Bangladesh. And as you mentioned, Natasha, one of the unique things about in Punjab as well, across Pakistan and India, but also in Sindh, the traditional Brahminical caste system does not exist in quite the same way. There is a caste hierarchy, but it functions in fundamentally different ways. And it's not, so I mean, this will get into sort of a very long discussion, but it is important to note that there are regional differences in how caste hierarchies are constructed, in how they are practiced, what kinds of exclusion and inclusion they include, or they you know, sort of come up with. And I think in Sindh, the sort of concatenation of very specific regional forms is an important thing to note in even understanding inequality in Sindh.
Thank you. Yeah, and continuing with this question about religion and caste, I'm going to frame a question more specifically around the relationship between the two in Pakistan, and I'm orienting this question to you, Chander and Kapil, and Juergen, also if you want to reference your work on Hinglaj Mata and your framework of solidification here. So I want to ask you about how a focus on an occupation with religion also shapes and obscures possibly caste questions and anti-caste struggles. I'm thinking here about recently circulating critiques by anti-caste, Dalit, and Pasmanda thinkers who have drawn our attention to how there are inter-religious dominant castes, so, you know, kind of Savarna, Sayed alliances and solidarities. And of course, earlier critiques, such as Ambedkar's of Savarna Hindu political formation, but also his own disillusionment with the allyship of the Muslim League after the Lahore Resolution, and his writings on how he saw the Muslim League as a kind of Ashraf elite religious political formation that undercut anti-caste struggle. We also have, as Ghazal has recently written about earlier this year, the history of Jogendranath Mandal and his hopes for recognition in Pakistan, but ultimately also feeling dejected by the over-determination and kind of occupation with religion. So in moving us from thinking of questions of origin to thinking about caste as a mechanism, Chander, you have said that caste is not a religious term. And in social media campaigns in 2017, around the census, there were memes circulating with the hashtag that said, I am a scheduled caste and a Hindu. Elsewhere, you've also talked about how scheduled caste versus upper caste are the real kind of indigenous Hindus to Pakistan. So in thinking about this, I want to ask you clearly if you could speak to how the struggles for Hindu recognition and scheduled caste justice overlap and diverge in Pakistan.
I think whenever being scheduled caste, we have tried for equality and justice in Pakistan. The upper caste Hindus who are Brahmins have always been biggest hurdle in our development. Like we were removed from the quota system in 1991 by the PMLN, and we all were considered as equal. And later on, when the census came, there was two separate portions for the Hindu identity. The one was Hindus, and the other one was scheduled caste only. Although scheduled caste is not a religion, and it was a responsibility of government to remove, to identify scheduled caste, to write the column of scheduled caste as scheduled caste Hindus. They just wrote scheduled caste as a separate religion, which has brought a biggest confusion within the community, and they faced a problem that if we will take the scheduled caste, then we will be counted the scheduled caste, which is a religion, although it is not a religious term. And the fight is also not religious. The fight is for the equality, for the justice of humans, for the justice of scheduled caste community who have been suffering for hundreds of years, who have been suffering from every kind of problem, like they are killed, they are attempting suicide. Unfortunately, indirectly, the suicide is also the problem, and suicide is also an issue which is directly or indirectly linked to the society which treats them unequal, which mishandle them, which mistreat them. So I think it's like this, that there was a need to organize something. To manage something through which the community should know that the scheduled caste and Hindus both in Pakistani terms are Hindus, but the identity of being scheduled caste is a lower caste Hindus, or is a separate identity, but it is a part of Hindu, which is not considered, and it is bringing a confusion, which has brought a problem, and they are still suffering from their representation in the assemblies, from their representation in the educational institutes, and from their representation in the employment in any sector.
Juergen or Kapil?
Go ahead, Kapil. I think you're better authority to speak on this.
Thank you. I think this question is really quite pertinent. The reason being because of Pakistan, what we see that most of I think the Hindu is the, let me explain more. I think if you think in the Lacan's language, so we are just like a master-slave relationship. So when the state is the master, so we are the second-class citizen. So state treats us, be it scheduled caste Hindus, be it the Dalit, whatever identity, be it the Kapil or someone else coming from the upper caste. So the state treats us as a second-class citizen. So we are just like subjects of this state. We are like the slaves of this state. We are the stepchildren of this state. So the rasa, the state treats as a second-class citizen. So when state thinks about the Hindus, Dalit, be it Kolhi, Bhil, Megwar, Brahman, Bania, whatever the caste is. So the state treats us equally as a second class. We are treated equally as a second class citizen. They are not differentiated. Yes, they are marginalized within marginalized. I do admit they are marginalized within marginalized. There is a historical, say, discrimination against them. So Dalit or scheduled caste could be their political identity, but the bigger outer membrane, outer layer of their identity is being a Hindu in Pakistan, as mentioned by Chander, and also the Ghazal slightly touched on this subject. So in a sense, we don't have that Brahminical structure, which is, you can say, quite is you can say that is having so much, you can say, dominance on in our daily life. Because most of the people coming from scheduled caste communities, they are working as a laborers or farmers in the lands of the Muslims. So they are working there. They are not working under the Hindus. Hindus are not landlords, okay, as such. They are not those big owners. They're working. Some of them, they are working under the Muslim, you know, say feudal lords, Muslim landlords, or Muslim tycoons like that. So they are primarily in their daily life. They are being ruled by them. They are being governed by them. So this is how I understand this whole question. Over to you, Juergen.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I learned so much from both of you also over the last years. I think a very interesting thought here is also in terms of the history of what we would call, Pakistani Hindus. I found it extremely interesting that when one searches for Urdu as a material, as a language where you find a lot of, for example, ritual manuals with gray literature, little stories about Hindu devdas and so on, that most of the things that one finds before the 90s is in the regional languages. There's a lot in Sindhi, obviously. Gujarati, Marwari would be the things, but Urdu is not really a language for spreading this kind of knowledge. Now, why is that? It's really hard. I mean, that's probably not one reason, but it would be interesting to think about this from this standpoint that before the 90s, it was really difficult to kind of connect on a more national language. No? So with the coming of later than on with social media, it was suddenly much more easy to communicate on a more national language, and then also using the national language to communicate in this, or then in other parts, not only Urdu or Sindhi, but also English as well. So the question is also, how the idea of the Pakistani Hindu identity, if whatever this might be, right, has moved from very small local networks to something that is on a national scale very recently. And by recently, I mean over the last 3 decades, right? This doesn't mean that there was nothing like this before, but on the scale that we see this kind of negotiation in popular culture, and people being able to exchange also their ideas with people on the other side of the border. In India, I think this is something that where the study that we're looking at is extremely, extremely interesting because so much happened over the last 30 years. And Hinglaj is, I think, just one. So Hinglaj, this huge temple in Balochistan, is, I think, one of these examples of religious sites, a pilgrimage site that witnessed an extreme push over a very, very short, brief period of time.
Thank you. Yeah, and if you have questions, instead of putting them in the chat, we can see them in the Q&A window. So Ghazal, one of the questions we got related to the responses that Juergen and Kapil and Chander have just offered us is around caste, scheduled caste identity and conversion. And you've already talked about how conversion, even in this muddy category of willful and forced, often there's a consensus that it does yield the exclusion of a woman from her natal family. Would you be able to speak a bit about whether and how conversion shapes caste discrimination for those who are Dalit or Adivasi and converting?
Thank you. Yeah, this is a great question. And I think it's a very important, it's one of the main drivers of the debate. So one of the issues that has come up, and I write about this a little in a paper that I recently published, although in a different context, is that it's fairly clear now through ongoing scholarship that conversion does not take away caste stigma. And there's a lot of studies on, recent studies on both Indian and Pakistani Punjab, on pre-partition South Asia in general, looking at, you know, cases of, you know, whole-scale communities that have converted, as well as individual situations. And it's not to say that that the shape of discrimination may not change in specific ways, but it does not do away with caste discrimination. One of the things that I found in my research, and I have published on this in the paper on Jogendranath Mandal that you mentioned, Natasha, is that for the Pakistani state in 1947, and you know, in this crucial period between 1947 and 1971, was that they were not able to understand these nuances. So for the state itself, which was in the process of understanding sort of a new future as a modern Muslim state, or however they wanted to see themselves, for them, issues like caste stigma stopped at the moment of conversion. And so you see in those National Assembly debates in 1948, 1949, that there are scheduled caste members of the assembly talking about trying to get safeguards put into place in the constitution, in the law. And these are actually, you know, completely stonewalled by the Muslim League and by majority, the ruling party, because the idea was that this is something that only applies to religious minorities in Pakistan, and it does not apply to Muslims. Although, as we have seen through increasing amount of scholarship on Pakistan, this is not the case in how caste operates in the country.
Thank you. Yeah, and it kind of echoes Chander's point about delinking caste and religion and being able to fight both struggles for Hindu religious recognition and scheduled caste justice. So in moving towards wrapping up, I just have two final questions, and I'll pose one and ask you to be brief. This is for Chander and Kapil, and then we'll leave last words to each of you in the final question. So one of, you know, in the opening, I talked about the kind of larger political context in terms of thinking about global Islamophobia and the war on terror. And I wanted to ask you how broader geopolitics shape and shape the ways that you make strategic and tactical decisions about fighting for minority recognition as Hindus in a Muslim majority state. And particular, I'm thinking about if you want to talk about how kind of Western imperial human rights discourse enters into how you're making claims on the Pakistani state. But also we have a question around Hindutva and the CAA. And I know Kapil and Chander, you've both told me how sometimes like Hindutva groups will try to co-opt struggles for Hindu recognition in Pakistan. And you've been contacted by right-wing Hindutva groups. So how do you engage with the fact that what you're struggling with in Pakistan also speaks to struggles outside of Pakistan, if that's clear? How, and if you want a specific question, there's a question about what the response to the CAA law in India has been from the Hindu community in Pakistan. Has it been uniform or varied? Just a brief response from Chander or Kapil.
I think the response to this Citizens Acts in India, the Pakistan has been negligible, almost negligible. So none of the Pakistanis, we hardly see that there is so much, welcoming of this Citizens Act in Pakistan. Because what we see that over the last period of last few years, the Indian economic situation has worsened. And most of the Pakistani Hindus who migrate professionals, they migrate to either the Gulf side, either the Middle East, or they're getting, applying for the immigration to Canada, Australia, US, or other Western countries. So there is hardly, even the Hindus, they have recently returned from India to Pakistan. So there is no such response as such on this. There is no, because that has not been welcomed as such. Though Hindus cannot publicly claim this, that we are welcome. Even I, being a Hindu, knows the internal dynamics of our community. So that has not been encouraged and welcomed, because that Hindutva, that fascist, this regime of Modi, that has been brutally criticized in Pakistan. because none of us encourage, because we being the minority in Pakistan feel more pain of the Muslim minority in India. So how can minority doesn't understand the discrimination and marginalization of other minority? So we do understand that Muslims in India, they are being discriminated. So similarly, we are being discriminated here. So that's why I think we understand that this is not a question. Yeah, Chander, you can add something.
Okay, Chander, maybe what I'll do is pose the final question, and then in your last remark, you can comment on this question of migration and Pakistani Hindus. And I've also seen in my own work with, I think there's some divide between the support for the law from Pakistani Hindus who have migrated to Western India versus those who have decided to stay. So in a final question, I wanted to give you an opportunity to say whatever final remark you'd like. And if you also, given the kind of current upheaval in Pakistan right now with the PDM and the Pakistan Democratic Movement, if there's anything that you'd like to add in terms of what your research or activism has shown in terms of an opening for Hindus in Pakistan to engage with this movement. And then we'll wrap up and conclude. So we'll start with Chander and then Ghazal and end with Juergen and Kapil if you have anything to add. Please keep it brief.
Thank you. For the previous question, which was about the migration of Hindus and the respect of Hindus for Prime Minister Modi, I would like to say that the Hindus are facing some problems in Pakistan, but they are managing with it. And the government is cooperating these days. We are moving towards a proper channel, and our issues are often resolved through the police stations, or they are having a proper scenario where the problems are often resolved, or the judiciary is also working properly and their cases are often responded on time. So I think for the migration, there is no point for Hindus to move there. And additionally, those families which have moved, which have migrated in past from Pakistan to India, it was because the economic conditions were so weak and they did not have any choice rather than moving to India. And they have been murdered as well. 11 persons from one family from Bhil community were murdered in India, and nothing happened till that. So we are not in a position. We are not thinking, or we Hindus are not planning to move towards that. And additionally, we are thinking that the government will resolve our issues very soon, and the problems will get resolved. And thank you.
Yeah, just building off what Chander said, I think, you know, it's, and Natasha, I think you and I have spoken about this before. It is interesting to see what, not just with the CAA, but with ongoing, you know, the ongoing political conditions in both Pakistan and India. It is interesting to see what kinds of ideas about the past are opened up, what kinds of new relationships to the past are reimagined. And just thinking about, so, you know, the past in terms of old forms of relationships between Hindus and Muslims, old forms of relationships between minorities in one place and minorities in the other, cross-border solidarity, etc. And just building off that, thinking about, you know, questions of the PDM, that is the movement, the rallies that are going on right now in Pakistan, etc. I think it's, you know, going back to what Chander, you talked about this movement that you had started observing when you were in Dubai in 2015. I think it is interesting to note that there is, you know, a constant future-oriented politics that is very much in the conversation in Pakistan. And now the question of, you know, it carries different modalities. It can have completely different shapes. It can also be, you know, suppressed quite abruptly, as we've seen in our lives. But there is, I think, an interesting way in which, you know, ideas about the past and ideas about the future sort of keep merging together in how we think about Pakistani politics. And I think that may be one way to sort of, that may be a note to end on, is as we imagine what's, you know, how to go forward, and thinking about your earlier note on impacts of the global war on terror, and seeing how sort of future orientation is continuously labored towards.
Thank you. And we're out of time, but I want to give, if it's okay to give Juergen and Kapil, if you have one last sentence remark to say, and then we can conclude. Yes.
Sorry, my net was connected. Is it me or is it my turn?
Yes, and then, yeah. And please keep it brief.
Yeah, I think recently, I think social media has played a very instrumental role. I think that's how things are changing in Pakistan. I think our voice is being heard. So that's how we are actually claiming for our identity in Pakistan and claiming for equal citizenship in Pakistan. Last year, a minister was removed because he used a derogatory remarks in Pakistan. One of the most influential minister of Punjab, Fazul Hasan Chauhan, he was removed. So I think things are also changing through social media. That has really played a very instrumental role. That's my last comment. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Kapil just stole my thunder. This is exactly also the point that I wanted to make. There, with new forms of communications, there are new little cracks and gaps and new forms of maybe counter publics that I think that we really need to have an eye on as well, to not only, you know, like look at the past, but also have an outlook into the future, you know, and who can participate in which space.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining. And there were a few questions that came in through chat, which I just saw because we were looking at the Q&A. So I hope that we can continue these conversations in the future and in person and virtually until then. Thank you, Iftikhar and Daniel and Gloria.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Juergen, Natasha, Chander, Ghazal, and Kapil for this very thought-provoking discussion. And please join us for our future events.